міжнародної торгівлі Mary Inc. в канадському парламенті проголосила модернізований варіант договору вільної торгівлі з Україною, який передбачає важливий аспект відбудови України.
Вітаємо вас, дорогі глядачі, на українській телемережі «Контакт». І сьогодні маємо приємність мати міністра Мері Інг, тут міністр зовнішньої торгівлі, яка тут в парламенті представила новий вигляд договору вільної торгівлі з Канади з Україною. Minister Ing, Mary, welcome to our show. Thank you for your time. And I just introduced you as the Minister of International Trade that's going to be speaking about the free trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine. Now, we've all been waiting for that to develop as presented a long time ago. And now I understand you presented in Parliament the new version of the trade agreement. But a little bit of a secret here, it was actually signed by the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of Ukraine during the visit just a few weeks ago. So, Minister Mary, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, well, thank you so much, Yuri. It's wonderful to be here at KONTAKT and wonderful to talk about this excellent agreement between Canada and Ukraine. So today in Parliament, I introduced this new trade agreement, this modernized and updated trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine. And you're absolutely right. Both Prime Minister Trudeau and President Zelensky signed this agreement during his visit here in September. And it was a real celebration because it is a commitment between Canada and Ukraine on the modernization of this agreement. And you know, I thought if your viewers were interested, I would just share a little bit of how this came to be.
Yeah, please do. We're interested in all the secrets.
Well, I mean, you'll remember that President Zelensky visited Canada in 2019, and at that time, he and Prime Minister Trudeau committed to modernizing KONTAKT. We call this agreement KONTAKT, the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. So, an acronym, in government they use a lot of these acronyms, they call it KONTAKT. So they agreed to modernize, and at the time, there was a lot of dialogue about how to work together between Canada and Ukraine to create better economic conditions and how we can modernize this agreement to enable greater job creation in Ukraine, benefiting Canadian businesses and exporters who do business and want to do business in Ukraine. So that's how this all began. And then, of course, the pandemic hit in 2020. So in 2020, we had to take a pause. Everyone took a bit of a pause around the world because we were all struggling and fighting to make sure that we looked after our people during COVID. And then, of course, we came to 2022. And in 2022, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of the Economy, Deputy Prime Minister Yulia and I announced that Canada and Ukraine would actually pursue the negotiation of a modernized free trade agreement. Now, you'll remember in January of that time, it was a very uncertain time for Ukraine. And prior to Deputy Prime Minister Shubdenko and I announcing this, we had, I had private conversations with my colleague from Ukraine, and said, look, does Ukraine still want to do this in light of the fact that we were seeing at that time troops were being amassed, Russian troops were being amassed around Ukraine. The situation was getting very uncertain, but I have to tell you, the unequivocal resolve by Ukraine to Canada was, look, now is a very critical time. In fact, it's an even more critical time now because Canada pursuing this trade agreement with us, for us to get into these negotiations, would mean that Canada is showing confidence in Ukraine. Confidence in an area that is important to trade and to their economy. And at this point, it was before the war started. We had hope. I think everyone had hope that the war wouldn't. And of course, a month from the time that Deputy Prime Minister Shubdenko and I announced that we were going to start these negotiations, war took place. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine took place, and that caused us to pause for a few months. Understandably so. Ukraine was fighting for Ukraine. And I found myself around a few months after the war began at the OECD. And while this wasn't planned, at the OECD, I met for the very first time the chief negotiator for Ukraine, Taras Kachka. He made his way to Paris. We had no plan to meet each other, to see each other at OECD. And frankly, it was 120 days into the war. And for him to even get to the OECD, he was sharing with me how difficult that journey was. But we found ourselves, in fact, I can remember vividly in my mind. We were in the basement, in the cafeteria, at the OECD. I had my chief negotiator, the Canadian chief negotiator, with me because we were there for a Canadian business. We were doing the work for Canada at the OECD, and I met Ukraine's chief negotiator. And there, I asked him. I said, "So, how are you doing?" He was recounting what the 120 days was like for the Ukrainian people, and I said, "Are you ready? Because I'll tell you, if you're ready, we're ready. We're there, and we will be there." And the chief negotiator, Taras, said, "We're ready, Minister. Let's go." And I said, and with that, we went and we negotiated. And now, a year later, this is the fastest trade agreement that Canada has ever negotiated. A comprehensive, high-quality trade agreement is what we call it in trade circles with Ukraine. And we did that. And I think here I have to give a lot of thank you to my Ukrainian counterparts, because they really saw this as important, and despite everything that they were going through, standing up for their sovereignty, their soldiers, and their people fighting for freedom and fighting for Ukraine's sovereignty, fighting for democracy, for a rules-based society, values that Canada shares as well. In spite of all of that they have and continue to do, they were at the table, and they were at the table with Canada, negotiating this agreement. And it's an excellent agreement. Like I said, in trade circles, it's called a high-quality agreement, and I'm happy to answer questions about what that is. But maybe a final point on a bit of the story. I finally, after that OECD period, later that summer, was at G7, and Germany was hosting G7. I was there, and I met Deputy Prime Minister Shrivenko for the first time in person. And we recalled the conversations we had. She shared with me what it was like over the many months that Ukraine was fighting for itself, for herself, and what we had wished at the very beginning that maybe war wouldn't happen. The unthinkable happened, but the Ukrainian people are fighting, and Julia and I, committed ourselves that we would do everything we can. Me as the trade minister, her as the minister of the economy, but the deputy prime minister, that we would do everything we can to ensure that we continue these negotiations. And now, 12 months later, she and I hugged there in Germany. That was the last time I saw her in person. But we hugged and we said, we're going to do this work, and here we are. So today's a very proud day for me and for my government. And the Prime Minister Trudeau knew, just like the people of Canada know, just like our government, myself, my colleagues, that as long as Ukraine stood, we were going to stand behind them and with them, and that's what you're seeing in this agreement.
Well, Minister Ng, welcome to our show, and the fascinating story that you've just told us about the perseverance on both sides, actually, on both sides of the table. And maybe you could follow up a little bit. What does modernization mean? And what does quality trade agreement mean in your circles?
Yeah, well, this agreement has new chapters on services, on investments. So that's really important, because I hear a lot from Canadian businesses and investors how important it is to have those rules, those kinds of chapters in a trade agreement. So we have them here, and I think that's really positive, because we know that when Ukraine is victorious and that there is a rebuilding effort, Canada wants to be a part of that. I think the Canadian companies want to be a part of that. There are many Canadian companies who are your viewers as well, who are part of the Ukrainian diaspora who will want to be a part of that. So new chapters like that, but also strong standards for labor, including small and medium-sized businesses in this agreement, so that small and medium-sized businesses can take advantage of trade on both sides. opportunities for Indigenous businesses to participate in trade with Ukraine. The highest standards in environmental protections for a Canadian trade agreement now is this agreement with Ukraine. And when I say high quality, it is comparable to the agreement we have with the European Union and CETA. It is comparable to the agreement that Canada has with the United States and Mexico, which was just recently renegotiated, of course, by my good colleague, the Deputy Prime Minister here in Canada, Chrystia Freeland. So that's what I mean about high quality, high standards. So chapters that are new, but those provisions that make us competitive, that really respect a rules-based order, but that really is that trade framework that's going to help Canadian businesses, Ukrainian businesses grow and grow into that long term, because that's how we see this relationship and what this trading relationship will be.
Well, Minister, absolutely all-rounded information from you today, both on the technical side and on the emotional side and on the perseverance side of how much work it took on both sides to get this free trade agreement into place. So thank you, not just for being with us here today, but for your fine performance in the House of Commons, presenting this reworked free trade agreement between Canada and Ukraine. Thank you very, very much for being with us today.